Ethan Morris felt the dull thud of his boots striking the metal ramp of the aircraft carrier, each step echoing somewhere inside his chest, a heavy, dense reverberation, as if the ship itself were testing him for resilience. The air above the deck was thick with the smells of fuel, machine oil, and salty wind. The mixture felt so dense it seemed one could cut it with a knife. He had expected order, precision, discipline. That was how he had always imagined service aboard the largest ship in the fleet. But reality hit sharper than the cold breeze. Chaos, the unending roar of engines, figures in multicolored vests rushing back and forth, and endless signals, auditory, visual, human. For a moment, it seemed he had stepped into another world, a place without a familiar horizon or any semblance of calm, only noise, weight, and the constant vibration beneath his feet. Almost immediately, a man in his 40s approached him, sturdy, with a tired face and eyes that looked as though they had long forgotten how to focus. This was Petty Officer Reyes. His voice came out rough, as though he hadn't heard his own words in a very long time. "Welcome, rookie, to the city where no one sleeps." There wasn't even a hint of a joke in his tone. Ethan wanted to smile, nod, say something that would reflect his enthusiasm, but the smile stuck somewhere inside, smothered by the sudden, sharp realization that this place was alive. And alive not in a romantic sense, but in a frightening one, like a beast that hums and growls, watching every step of those who dare to walk upon its steel hide. Reyes led Ethan through narrow corridors where the bulkheads nearly brushed their shoulders. The air inside was hotter than outside, as if the ship was warming itself from within with its own tension. People moved quickly, barely lifting their eyes. No one looked rested. No one looked surprised or curious. Everyone was part of the motion, part of an endless process where individuality dissolved into duty. In the berthing compartment, Reyes pointed at Ethan's rack, a narrow alcove in the wall, barely larger than a sleeping bag. Above and below it were identical spaces, each already containing someone's belongings, someone's attempt to preserve at least the illusion of personal space. Ethan ran his hand along the edge of the metal shelf and felt a cold that refused to fade, even beneath his warmth. "Get used to it," Reyes said, as if reading his thoughts. "This isn't the place for people who like space, and it's not the place for people who like silence." He walked out, leaving Ethan alone inside the tiny can of metal, pipes, and dim light. Voices, footsteps, and the dull rumble of the ship's machinery still echoed in the corridor. But only a few minutes later, a deafening roar erupted. Somewhere above him, a plane took off. The entire hull shuddered as if struck by a giant's fist. Ethan instinctively gripped the edge of his rack, feeling the vibration travel through his body, through his bones, straight into his skull. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air was too heavy. A strange, sticky anxiety was building inside him. He had prepared himself for service, for hardships, for discipline. But he had not been ready for the feeling that the ship devoured time. There was no day or night here, no silence, no distance from people, from orders, from noise. It seemed as though the entire ship existed as one tense, overworked heart beating far too fast. When Reyes returned, Ethan asked, "You said nobody sleeps here. Was that an exaggeration?" Reyes looked at him with a long, unreadable gaze, and for a moment there was a spark in his eyes. Not anger, not exhaustion, but a deep, cynical truth. "Nobody sleeps here, kid. People just close their eyes between shifts. That's not the same thing."
Those words stayed with him far more strongly than the ship's noise, the vibration, or the chaos of the deck. In that moment, Ethan felt for the first time that he was no longer certain where he had arrived. At a duty station, or inside a massive metal organism that fed on human time and strength without giving anything back. And when, at night, in a futile attempt to sleep, he heard another takeoff and felt his rack tremble again, he understood. The romance had stayed on shore. Here began real life. Life inside a steel world where every step, every breath, and every moment belonged to the ship. Morning on the aircraft carrier was no different from night. There was no sunrise to bring relief, no sunset to mark the end of the day. The corridor lights glowed the same as always, cold, flat, indifferent. Ethan woke not to an alarm, but to a crash behind the bulkhead. Something heavy had fallen, or someone was swearing loudly. He opened his eyes and realized he had awakened already exhausted, as if the ship kept draining strength even from his sleep. He went to his watch with the other sailors, their faces uniformly gray from lack of sleep, their movements mechanical. He noticed that no one talked in the mornings here. No one asked, "How did you sleep?" because everyone already knew the answer, and no one needed to hear it. The work was monotonous and demanded attention, yet the very atmosphere seemed to lull him. The hum of the ship became a background noise the brain eventually stopped responding to, and Ethan caught himself sometimes unable to distinguish a command from his own inner voice. At one point, he looked around and saw one of the technicians, a young guy with dark circles under his eyes, standing in front of a control panel with an empty stare, as if trying to remember why he was there. Ethan wanted to ask if he was all right, but Lieutenant Stanley got there first. His steps were sharp, his voice firm and stretched tight. "Manning, you're zoning out again. One more time and I'll pull you off the shift. Understood?" The young man only nodded. No objections, no excuses. A broken person who no longer tried to defend himself. Stanley turned to Ethan, his gaze assessing, heavy. "You're new. Adapt fast. Mistakes here cost lives, and you don't have time to learn slowly." He spoke calmly, but there was tension in his tone. Not anger, pressure. As if he too lived under a weight no one could see, one that squeezed him just as hard as it did the enlisted men. Soon, I saw it with my own eyes.
He stepped into the break room by accident. He'd been looking for tools. The room was tiny. 3 chairs, a table with a mug of dried coffee someone had left behind, and a video screen showing the news without sound. Sitting there was a woman in a white coat, Dr. Linda Harris, the ship's psychologist. A stack of forms lay on the table in front of her. "You're Ethan?" She looked up, and he was struck by how tired her eyes were. "I know the list of new arrivals." She smiled, but the smile was strained, as if her muscles no longer remembered how to do it naturally. "How's the adaptation going?" "I think fine, ma'am," Ethan replied uncertainly. "You think so, or you're saying what you're supposed to say?" Her voice was gentle, but the meaning cut sharply. He fell silent. Harris nodded, as though she hadn't expected an answer anyway. "People here run on autopilot. Fine is a word that means didn't collapse, didn't pass out, didn't break protocol." She glanced at the stack of forms. "Every month I get more cases. Insomnia, anxiety, intrusive thoughts. But the reports sent up the chain, they prefer not to see the problem." Her words settled in Ethan's chest like a stone. At that moment, the door swung open sharply, and Reyes burst into the room. He looked as if he hadn't slept in 2 days, eyes bloodshot, lips pressed into a thin line. "Doc, it's Manning again. He's sitting in the tech compartment saying he can hear the ship talking to him. Can you?" Harris stood up instantly, her quick reaction proving that exhaustion hadn't dulled her reflexes. "I'm coming." She left with Reyes, leaving Ethan alone in the room where the digital clock ticked and the silent screen kept flickering. He sat there, listening to his heartbeat race faster and faster. He understood now that he was in a place where the human mind was just another part of the mechanism, like a bolt or a washer, and if it broke, it would simply be replaced. After his shift, Reyes found him on the deck. A gloomy, overcast light hung above the sea. Impossible to tell whether it was day or evening. "You saw a lot today that rookies usually don't see this early," Reyes said. "People, they look like they live in constant fear." "Because they do. You noticed how Stanley yells?" Reyes gave a joyless smirk. "He's not a bad guy.
Even officers can't let their spirits drop. Nobody here has the right to be a person, only a function. He stared for a long time at the deck where technicians darted back and forth, at the aircraft whose engines roared as if forcing vibrations straight into the air. "Have you ever wanted to run away?" he asked. Reyes gave a joyless snort. "Everyone here wants to, but there's nowhere to run. As long as this steel beast moves across the sea, we're in its stomach." Those words were more frightening than any order. That evening, as Ethan tried to fall asleep, he once again heard the sound of a jet taking off, and the vibration ran through his bones. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the noise was inside the ship, inside his head. And for the first time since arriving, he felt not just exhaustion, but fear. Fear that the pressure wasn't coming from the sea outside, but from within.
The workday began the same as always, with the sensation that the night had never ended. Ethan walked down the corridor, where the air hung motionless, like in a stifling tunnel. The lights glared with the same unchanging brightness, the bulkheads were smeared with handprints, and the hum of the engine room made thoughts feel thick. He had already learned not to look for silence. It simply didn't exist here. Preparations for a training launch were underway on the deck. It felt as though everything was moving in a closed loop. They performed the same actions again and again, and it was the repetition that frightened Ethan the most. Under the weight of exhaustion, it turned into a trap. The sailors moved like a poorly wound mechanism, some driven by inertia, some with empty eyes, some with a heavy, watchful tension. Ethan spotted Manning. He stood with a hose in his hands, staring at the deck as if he were seeing something alive instead of a metal surface. His hands were trembling. His face was pale, his lips dry. Ethan wanted to approach him, but at that moment a command rang out. The launch began. The aircraft, as if breaking free from a cage, rolled down the deck and shot upward in a blinding burst of light. The roar sent a pounding through Ethan's temples, and the vibration slammed into his legs. He nearly lost his balance, and noticed that Manning staggered too, but not from the noise. His eyes glazed over, and in the next second he made a wrong move. A technician working nearby shouted sharply, "He didn't secure the line!" Ethan felt the world jerk. What followed happened in an instant. A loud metallic screech, a section of equipment ripping loose, and the technician dropping to one knee and covering his face with his hands. Everyone rushed to him. Manning stood frozen, trembling as if waking from a nightmare. Stanley was the first to arrive. He bent down to the injured man, then turned toward Manning. His face had gone pale. "Do you understand you could have killed someone, ruined the entire operation? His voice cracked, and Stanley exhaled sharply as though holding himself back from screaming even louder. Manning only whispered, I heard. The ship said the line was secure." He silenced. Stanley froze. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine, because he'd heard similar words from Reyes, and from other sailors who had spent far too many nights without sleep. It wasn't a metaphor. People had begun to hear the ship. The incident hadn't resulted in a major accident, but the injured technician was taken for a medical exam, and Manning was escorted away by an officer. After that, the rest of the shift dragged on, as if everyone had begun to breathe more carefully. At lunch, Reyes looked gloomier than usual. He ate in silence, without lifting his head. "You saw it?" Ethan asked quietly. Reyes nodded, wiping his hands with a napkin as though trying to rub off something sticky. "I saw, and I've seen it before." He leaned back and closed his eyes. "People's inner spring snaps here. First you sleep too little, then you mix up your commander's voice with your own. Then you start hearing the ship talking to you. That's when the real shit begins." He opened his eyes, dull, tired, stripped of his usual sarcasm. "You know what's worst? When people start making mistakes, they don't even realize it's the exhaustion moving their hands." That evening, Ethan found Dr. Harris in the medical bay. She looked even more worn out than the last time she'd seen her. Reports lay on the table, notes about insomnia, complaints, incidents. "Manning," Ethan began. Manning set down her pen. Her face grew serious, but her eyes showed pain rather than clinical detachment. "I know. His condition is one of those things I can't fix. All I can do is document it. And the system," she sighed, "the system says everything is fine as long as a person is still standing." "And if he collapses?" Ethan asked. "Then he was the weak link," she said quietly, though her voice carried a metallic edge. Ethan felt a wave of protest rise inside him, but the silence around them pressed harder than any argument. That night, Ethan walked down an empty corridor and saw Reyes. He stood by the bulkhead, resting his forehead against the cold metal. His shoulders were trembling. "Reyes, you okay?" The senior sailor slowly turned. His face was pale, his eyes red. "I'm tired, Ethan. Too tired. You know, sometimes I think that if I stepped overboard, it would be quiet, for the first time in a long while. Just quiet." The words sliced through the air. Ethan stepped closer, but Reyes raised a hand, asking silently for a moment. He took a deep breath, forcing control back into his body. "Don't mind me, kid. I've just overstayed my limit." But Ethan could see it. The man was standing on the edge, and the ship beneath their feet hummed, as though urging that edge forward. When Ethan lay down in his rack, the ship shuddered again from a takeoff. He closed his eyes, but in the darkness, the noise became many-voiced, as if a whole chorus of mechanical whispers was leaning into his ears.
He understood then, everyone has a breaking point, and many here had already crossed theirs. The day the ship set course for the nearest port began just like all the others, with that anxious hum that crept into sleep, as if someone were methodically tapping on the inside of your skull. But there was something different in the air today. A taut expectation, as if the thousands of people trapped inside the steel giant had all held their breath at once. Ethan walked down the corridor to his assigned station, feeling every step echo as a heavy pull in his knees. Over the past weeks, he had grown used to the constant lethargy, but today the feeling was thicker, denser, as if the ship itself had grown heavier, or as if the people inside it had begun to sag under their own exhaustion. The maintenance bay was filled with an abrupt silence, unusual for this place. Reyes, who was supposed to work with Ethan, sat on a crate of tools with his head lowered. He looked as though only habit kept him upright. "How are you?" Ethan asked carefully. Reyes lifted his eyes. They were dull, like coffee diluted with seawater. "Me?" He gave a crooked smile. "Still standing, for now." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but at that moment Stanley entered the bay. Today he looked especially tense, shoulders raised, steps sharp, a worry in his eyes, concealed beneath official sternness. "Listen carefully," he said. "Command received the report on the incident. Dr. Harris is bringing up the issue of workload again, but," he paused on the word as though it were barbed, "there will be no major changes." A grave silence fell over the bay. "What do you mean, no changes? We're barely staying on our feet." Stanley flinched as if someone had thrown a stone at his chest. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture Ethan had never seen from him before. "I know," he said quietly. "I spoke to the captain. I told him everything I could. But those above think we're managing. And as long as no one has died, the shifts will stay the same." The words sounded like a sentence. Later, during a short break, Ethan went to the medical bay. The door was slightly open. He saw Harris sitting at her desk, surrounded by folders stacked like barricades. She held herself upright, but her eyes betrayed a deep helplessness.
"May I?" he asked softly. She looked up and nodded. "How are you holding up?" "Fine, I guess." Ethan sat down across from her. "I just wanted to ask, is it really as bad as it seems?" Harris closed one of her folders, as if hiding a heavy burden from him. "Ethan," she said, her voice gentle yet edged with steel, "you have to understand, the human psyche has a limit, and this ship is built in such a way that crossing that limit is normal. This isn't just a workplace, it's a machine that grinds people down into usable material." She leaned forward. "When I tell command that the crew is depleted, they look at the task completion reports. If the metrics are stable, then the problem is considered insignificant. Do you understand? But these are people. They can't go on forever." Harris let out a tired, humorless smile. "That's exactly what I've been telling them every month." For a moment, Ethan felt an odd urge to apologize to her for being part of the system that was breaking people like her. But what good were apologies? When the ship finally reached port, the crew was granted a few hours of shore leave. For many, it was supposed to be salvation. But the reality was different. Even on land, the sailors looked lost. Some sat on benches, staring blankly into space. Some slept upright, leaning against the port walls beneath the drone of machinery. Some drank as if trying to drown their own brains in alcohol. The laughter drifting nearby felt wrong, nervous, hollow, like an attempt to convince themselves that the world still existed. Ethan walked along the pier and felt a strange lightness. The noise was still there, but different. More lively, more human. Yet his thoughts kept circling back to the ship, to the people who remained inside it, trapped like in a sealed steel stomach. He stopped by a metal railing and watched the waves crash against the concrete. Clear water, the smell of salt, a gentle breeze. He had forgotten that air could feel fresh. Reyes approached. He was holding a bottle of lemonade, but he looked hollow inside. "Strange feeling, isn't it? It's like you've been let out, but there's still a leash around your neck. Do you think, when we go back, it'll get easier?" Reyes let out a tired, bitter laugh. "Easier? No. But at least for a little while we remembered that the world is bigger than those corridors. That's enough. For a few days." He looked at the ship, standing still, a massive black shape looming over the water. "And then the noise will come back, and we'll start listening to the ship talk again." That evening, when they returned aboard, every sailor's steps had grown heavier, as if they weren't returning to work, but to something inevitable and merciless. When he crossed the gangway, the hull of the carrier hummed softly. He knew that sound too well. And in that moment, Ethan understood. The silence he'd felt on shore had been an illusion. True silence, the kind that lives inside a person, had long since abandoned them. Only this remained, a silence beneath the thunder, where everyone either heard themselves too clearly or stopped hearing themselves at all. After the brief respite on shore, the carrier returned to the sea. It felt as though the ship itself had been impatiently waiting for the moment when people would once again step inside its metal walls so it could swallow them back into its roaring, vibrating body. By the second day after departure, Ethan felt the thin shell of relief brought by land beginning to crack. The work routine returned faster than he expected. So quickly it was as if no one had ever left the ship. Fatigue pressed itself back into daily life like a permanent backdrop. It was no longer just a state of mind. It had become part of every movement, every breath. People walked with lowered shoulders again, spoke briefly again, stared into empty space between tasks again. Ethan caught himself thinking that even the sea wind, usually sharp and cool, now felt like an extension of the same suffocating heaviness that filled the corridors. Stanley behaved differently. He spoke more quietly, raised his voice less often. Sometimes it seemed as if he carried an invisible burden, something heavier than any orders from above. During the morning briefing, he looked as though he hadn't slept, not because he had been working, but because he had been thinking. "We have another shift reorganization," Stanley said, looking at the tablet, though his voice sounded distant. "I'll try to distribute the load so it doesn't all fall on the same people." One of the technicians snorted skeptically. "We're going to get crushed anyway. Doesn't matter how you shuffle us." Stanley raised his eyes. For a moment something hard flashed in them, but the emotion faded almost instantly. "I'm doing everything I can. Believe me, I know what you're going through." The words were simple, almost unremarkable, yet they sounded different than any order he had ever given. As if a crack had appeared inside the officer, a crack of understanding. As the team slipped back into its familiar rhythm, Ethan found himself watching Reyes more often. He seemed to be fading, not quickly, worse than that, slowly, frighteningly slowly. He spoke less, his movements became cautious, almost tentative, as if any effort might push his body past its limit. One late evening, Ethan found him at the stern. Reyes was leaning against the railing, staring into the darkness of the sea. The waves below were almost black, thick, and they seemed to breathe.
"I've been looking for you," Ethan said as he approached. "I know," Reyes replied, without lifting his gaze. "It's easy to get lost here, even when you're standing still." A chill ran up Ethan's spine. There was no threat in Reyes's voice, no despair, only exhaustion. Heavy, endless exhaustion. "You said you'd leave after demobilization," Ethan reminded him. Reyes gave a sad, crooked smile. "I said a lot of things, but one thing I know for sure, I don't want the ship deciding any more when I sleep, when I wake up, when I think. I want silence, real silence." He turned to Ethan. "Take care of your head, kid. This ship doesn't break backs. It breaks thoughts." That night, something happened that Ethan would remember for a long time. He woke up with the feeling that someone had tugged him by the shoulder. When he opened his eyes, he heard someone whispering in the corridor, fast, frantic. "He's gone! Reyes is gone!" Ethan sprang out of his rack, pulled on his boots, and ran into the corridor. The look in everyone's eyes was the same, fearful, clouded. They rushed toward the stern, to the place where the darkness of the sea always seemed the deepest. But Reyes was not overboard. He was sitting by the bulkhead, his hands clutching his head. Dr. Harris was nearby, quietly speaking something meant to soothe. Reyes wasn't crying, on the contrary. He was motionless, as if his mind had shut down to protect itself from overheating. Ethan felt the cold spread inside him. The man hadn't fallen. He was quietly dissolving. After that incident, Command held another meeting. Stanley, breaking from his usual restraint, spoke louder than normal. "We are losing people. Physically, morally. I'm requesting a redistribution of hours. We cannot continue at this pace." The captain looked at him coldly, as if this were a matter of statistics, not of human lives. "We are completing our tasks. Discipline levels are within norms. No official violations have occurred." "And the breakdowns?" Harris interjected. "The exhaustion? The cases where people report hearing the ship?" "Psychological difficulties are part of the service," the captain snapped. Stanley stood abruptly. "Then I'm filing a report. If you cannot protect the crew, at least let me try." The room went silent. No one had expected this from a man who had always been the embodiment of orders. Ethan looked at him and for the first time saw a human being rather than a rank. That evening, Ethan went out onto the deck. The sun was setting, painting the sky in reddish hues. He stood alone,
feeling the ship's vibration pass through the soles of his boots, as if the metallic beast beneath him were still breathing.
He thought of Reyes, of Manning, of Harris, of Stanley, who had rebelled for the first time against his own role, and of himself. Life aboard the ship gave much and took even more. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to think what he had always driven away. Perhaps he wasn't made for this endless race between fatigue and duty. Perhaps choosing is not weakness. Perhaps true strength is to walk away while there is still something worth saving. He looked at the setting sun and felt a quiet, almost imperceptible relief rising within him. He did not yet know what he would choose, but for the first time in a long while, the decision belonged to him. And in this metallic world that devoured every scrap of human silence, the thought of choice rang louder than anything else.